Breakthrough. Chapter 4. Madeline. When Madeline's alarm went off, her first thought was, today's the day. It was her 16th birthday, and she would be tested that afternoon. She felt a flash of nervousness as she thought about that. It wasn't anything major. She just didn't like others seeing the contents of her mind. Besides, it made her uncomfortable to be sitting in the very same chair where her mother had been killed. Do not think about that, she lectured herself. Not only will it do you no good whatsoever, but you should be glad she was found and eliminated before she could do too much damage. With a sigh, Madeline climbed from bed and headed to the kitchen where breakfast waited. Her father nodded to her, just like he did every morning. There was no special treatment for her just because it was her birthday. Madeline had heard that in the old days, back when everywhere was tainted by secrets and lies. Almost everyone made a big deal about their birthdays. But now it was uncommon because it was widely believed that celebrating made individuals stand out more than was proper. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but as her father put it, no need to give anyone any ideas that they're special. We are all equal here. Still, Madeline's mother had always made a point to make the day special for her and her brother. She would either make a cake or leave some small gift next to their plates at breakfast. But her father made no such point. That would go against his belief. And Madeline understood that. But as she ate her cereal in silence, she found herself missing the old days. As she was putting her bowl in the dishwasher, her father looked up from his crossword puzzle. "Oh yes," he said. "I almost forgot to tell you. Your time slot is directly after lunch." "I know," Madeline said. "Mr. Bass told me yesterday." "All right," her father said. "Make sure you don't forget." "Wouldn't dream of it," she said as she hurried out the door. "Bye." A few hours later, Madeline sat in class with the rest of the students, listening to the teacher drone on about quadratic equations. When there was a knock on the door. "Come in," her teacher, Mr. Brass, called. The door opened, and Madeline was surprised to see the principal walk in. "Good morning, class," he said. "Can I help you?" Mr. Brass inquired. "Yes," the principal replied. "It's about those books you borrowed. You were supposed to return them to me 3 days ago." "Oh, well, they're not here," Mr. Brass said. "Then where are they?" the principal demanded. "They're at home," Mr. Brass explained. The principal was looking at him weirdly. "Those books were for children," he said evenly. "You don't have a child anymore. What reason would you have to take them home?" "Well, I wanted to read them," Mr. Brass said. "There were some things I wanted to refer to for one of my classes." "What in those old books would you have to refer to for math and science classes?" the principal asked, not missing a beat. "Just some research methods they used in the old world," Mr. Brass responded. But anyone could see he was making it up. "I don't believe you," the principal said calmly. "I'm sorry, but I think you're lying. You will have to be tested." Mr. Brass went pale. "Oh, no, that's not necessary," he said quickly. "I'll bring the books back tomorrow. I don't need to be tested." "Oh, I think you do," the principal said, and then pointed to the door. "Let's go." He began to lead Mr. Brass out when he turned. "Everyone go to the gym until we return," he ordered. Then his eyes fell on Madeline. "Madeline, it's your birthday today, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," she replied. "Well then, why don't you come with us?" he suggested. "Your class won't be doing anything important until after your teacher is tested. This way you won't miss anything." "All right," Madeline said, standing up. She was supposed to go after lunch, but the principal was right. It would be more productive if she went now. She followed the principal and her teacher from the building. At first she was surprised that the principal was going with them to the reader, but then she realized why. Mr. Brass looked like he would run away if given the chance. Now Madeline was beginning to wonder if maybe Mr. Brass had lied. The thought made her shudder. 2 liars in 1 year. That would not make anyone happy. When they reached the reader, a guard met them at the door. "Are you here for your test?" the guard asked. The principal nodded. "I'm just bringing these two to be tested. It's the girl's birthday today, and the man has been suspected of lying." The guard typed something in on his computer, then nodded. "All right, there's just enough time for the 2 of you to be tested. Follow me." The principal headed back out the door, and Madeline hurried after her teacher and the guard. As they stepped into the reader room, Madeline felt a shiver run up her spine. This was hardly the first time she'd laid eyes on the reader, but it never ceased to scare her. She knew it was silly, but she couldn't help herself. This machine had the power to decide people's fates, and it essentially controlled everyone who lived in the community. After the guard left, a young man stepped out from a small control room. Madeline smiled in recognition. It was her brother's best friend, Andrew. Hi, Andrew, Madeline said. Hello, Andrew replied stiffly. Andrew was never one to be distracted when he was working. You will go first, he told Madeline. Without another word, she walked over and sat down in the chair, trying not to feel nervous, and waited while Andrew hooked her up to the machine. Then he disappeared into the control room. This was the hard part. She had to sit still and wait while the contents of her mind appeared on a screen in the control room. She didn't feel a thing, and somehow that was the strangest part of all. Madeline had always expected it to hurt, even though she had been tested multiple times. Madeline had no idea how it would be possible to go over all of that information in a few minutes, but her brother had said that just learning how to understand the information of the reader could take years to master. So she hadn't asked too much about it. Finally, Andrew stepped out of the room and unhooked her from the machine. You're all good, he reported. Madeline breathed a silent sigh of relief as she stood up and headed for the door. But before she could leave, she heard Mr. Brass say, No, please don't test me. There's no reason to. Andrew cut him off. Well, I think you're lying now, he said calmly, so come over and sit down. Madeline knew she should go, but she wanted to know if Mr. Brass had lied or not. So she stood next to the door, watching as Andrew attached her teacher to the machine, then went into the control room. When he stepped out, he looked surprised and disappointed. I'm sorry, he said as he unhooked Mr. Brass, but the reader always tells the truth, and it shows that you have lied. I now know everything, including that you have a disability hiding in your house. Mr. Brass nodded. It was weird, but he no longer looked afraid, just resigned. I suppose we always knew the truth would come out someday, he said. We were just prolonging it for as long as we could. There should never have been a lie in the first place, Andrew said as he reached into a cabinet and pulled out a syringe with a needle. Now you will pay the price for your sin. So will your wife and daughter. We really believed Talia ran off, but why should we have? She was a 7-year-old girl at the time. We should have suspected you two then. But we didn't. You were exceptional liars. But now it's time to die. Mr. Brass nodded again. Then do it, he snapped. I don't see any reason for you to torment me. Of course. Andrew said casually, walking over and rolling up Mr. Brass's sleeve and plunging the needle into his vein. Mr. Brass's face didn't look pained. In fact, he only appeared weakened. This is a blessing, he said in an obvious attempt to sound defiant, but his voice was so weak that Madeline almost couldn't hear it. This way I would have to live in this horrible place for one more moment. I only pray that my wife and daughter somehow escape and find a better place to live. Somewhere where imperfection doesn't matter. Then he collapsed. Madeline let out a small cry, maybe of grief or maybe shock. She wasn't even sure herself. Andrew looked over at the sound. If you have nothing better to do, then go call this number, he ordered, handing her a piece of paper. It's the work number of his wife. Tell her that her husband is dead and that the inspectors will be coming to search her house, and that she and her daughter will be killed. Then go back to school, and it would be better if you did not spread this around. If people ask, tell them her teacher lied and has been killed. Don't say anything else. I won't, Madeline promised. Good, Andrew said. Now get going. Madeline nodded and hurried from the room, trying to get her teacher's last words from her mind. She stepped in front of the phone in the hall and dialed with trembling fingers. Someone answered on the second ring. Hello, is it Mrs. Brass? Madeline asks. Yes, the woman replied. I'm just calling to tell you that your husband has been found a liar and is dead. He was tested, and now they know everything, Madeline explained, hating the way her voice sounded. This woman was receiving the worst news of her life, and Madeline sounded almost casual. She heard the sharp intake of breath from the other end of the phone, but she pretended not to. Also, the inspectors will be coming to search your house very soon. They will kill you and your daughter. She did feel bad saying it so bluntly, but she didn't know how else to do it. Then something occurred to her. What is your address? She asked. 65 Ribbon Crescent, the woman replied. Madeline stifled a gasp. She hung up the phone and hurried for the door. She couldn't believe it, but the address the woman had just told her was the same one where she'd seen the person in the window. And now it all made sense. That person who had ducked out of sight so quickly was a disability. And not just any disability. Back before Talia had fallen, she and Madeline had been friends. Madeline was a year older, but she remembered sometimes hanging out with Talia after school. She hadn't thought of Talia in years, but now she wondered if she should do anything about it. As soon as the thought crossed her mind, she flinched. Of course she shouldn't do anything. Talia needed to die. Her parents too. So why did it feel so wrong? What was wrong with her anyway? Ever since her mother had been killed, she had such strange thoughts. Thoughts that were borderline rebellious. She had to get a grip. If she kept thinking about helping disabilities, she would turn into her mother, and she didn't want that. She didn't. But even as she had the thought, she knew she didn't really believe it. There was a part of her, a part that she'd pushed down and ignored for months, that agreed with what her mother had done. As if things couldn't get any worse, Mr. Brass's words were playing in her head over and over like a soundtrack as she exited the building. When she returned to school, she found that she really didn't want to go in, but it wasn't optional, so she swung open the door and walked purposely toward the gym. When she got there, she found her classmate milling around talking. As soon as she entered, Nina ran up to her. "Hey," she said, "is Mr. Brass coming?" Madeline shook her head, and Nina put a hand to her mouth. "Oh my gosh," she said, "you mean he did lie?" "Yes," Madeline said. They killed him a few minutes ago." She kept her word and didn't say anything about the disability. "Oh, that's horrible," Nina said, her face going suddenly white. "Are you alright?" Madeline asked. I don't know," Nina said. "Can you just tell me, did you watch?" Madeline thought that was a strange thing to ask, but she nodded. "But I really wish I hadn't," she said. "Yeah," Nina agreed. "I would never want to watch someone die." "What was it like?" Rita, a friend of Nina's, asked, apparently having overheard their conversation. "Not the way it is in books," Madeline said. "I don't think he was in pain or anything. They just injected him, and after a moment he collapsed. I think it was that simple." "Good," Nina said. "I wouldn't have wanted him to suffer." "Not trying to sound like a parent or anything," Rita said, "but were you supposed to be watching that?" "No," Madeline replied. "But after I got tested, I couldn't bring myself to leave until I knew whether or not Mr. Brass was a liar." "Understandable," Nina said. "It's weird," Rita reflected. "We spend hours and hours with these people. We feel we can trust them. Then we find out they've been infected and must die. It really makes you realize how important it is to always tell the truth." "I know what you mean," Madeline said. "I never thought Mr. Brass, of all people, would lie." "No, me neither," Nina said, and suddenly there were tears in her eyes. Both Madeline and Rita just stared for a moment. Nina never cried. She was always smiling and optimistic, even at the worst of times. "What's wrong?" Madeline asked, putting an arm around her friend's shoulders. I can't say," she said through her tears. Then she pulled away from Madeline and ran in the direction of the washroom. "Well, that was unexpected," Rita commented. "I know," Madeline said. "I wonder what was wrong." "Did she have some sort of special connection with Mr. Brass, do you think?" Rita asked. "Not that I knew of," Madeline said. "Let's not forget, she's adopted," Rita said, lowering her voice. "Maybe he was her real father." They weren't really supposed to talk about the parents of adopted children, but people did anyway. "Could be," Madeline said, though she doubted it. "They don't look at all alike." "Well, that doesn't necessarily mean anything," Rita said, then stopped as Alex, Nina's twin brother, approached them. "Hey, Nina just ran out of the room crying," he said. "Do you know why?" "Mr. Brass lied and was killed," Madeline said shortly. Alex's face immediately drained of color, and he hurried after his sister. "Well, that answers that question," Rita said. "Either Mr. Brass was their father, or he had some close relationship with them back in the day." Madeline nodded. "Poor them," she said. "I know," Rita said. "I can't imagine having to lose your parents, let alone having to pretend you never knew them." "Yeah," Madeline agreed. At that moment, the bell rang, signaling the end of second period. "Time for science," Madeline said as they headed for the door. She really enjoyed it, and was very glad to end this conversation. "Yeah," Rita said. "I think I'll check on Nina before class, though, just to make sure she's alright." "Good idea," Madeline said. "Let the teacher know where we are if we're not back in time," Rita said before hurrying down the hall in the opposite direction. As Madeline made her way toward class, she couldn't help but wonder if Rita was right about Nina's parentage. That would certainly explain her reaction when she heard about his death. But that couldn't be right. Talia didn't have siblings. She couldn't have. Madeline would remember if her best friend had a sister who died. And it wasn't that she didn't remember Talia. The girl was a dim memory, far back in her mind, but they had been friends. Or at least, they'd hung out after school a fair number. No, she decided it's gotta be something else. Maybe Mr. Brass had been an uncle or something. Either way, it didn't matter. She wasn't supposed to be thinking about those things, and she forced herself to focus on the present.